Hello everyone and welcome to today's CodeBase on the Couch webinar. My name is Vanessa. I'm based up at One CodeBase in Aberdeen, and if you're not familiar, CodeBase is a tech cluster and we work with startups across the UK. We have 3 sites in Edinburgh, Stirling and Aberdeen, so once this is all over, feel free to come and say hi to any of those places. CodeBase on the Couch is a series of talks that we launched since everything happened, and it's kind of designed to connect community together with topics that are affecting the community at the moment. So we've had things like HR, kind of apprenticeships, and all those cool fun stuff, but they're all uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So if you have some spare time and want to catch up, then check out CodeBase Edinburgh's YouTube channel and all the videos are uploaded. So we'll just get started with the webinar. So we're joined today by Ian Henderson from Bad Dinosaur. Thank you so much for joining us today. So Bad Dinosaur, they work closely with entrepreneurs and they distill their vision into lean and efficient software projects. So Bad Dinosaur was founded in 2013. And they design and build apps for startups, existing businesses, and kind of everyone in between. Is that right, Ian?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Cool. So today we're going to be talking about building the MVP way. And at the end of the webinar, there will be a chance for a Q&A. So feel free to leave any questions that you've got in the box below in the Q&A section or even in the chat section, and we'll go through them at the end. Feel free to pop in a question at any point during the webinar as well. So yeah, I'll just pass over to Ian to get started.
Okay. Hello everyone, welcome, and I'll just do a quick introduction. My name's Ian, I'm a developer at Bad Dinosaur, and as Vanessa said, we're a software design and development agency based in Edinburgh, and we specialise in helping entrepreneurs and small businesses bring their idea to reality. So today, we mainly focus on prototypes, web apps, native apps, and project rescue, so that's if people have had horrible times with other developers, and user testing. And we do this really, really fast by applying something called an MVP ideology. Now, some of you that are listening or there will know what MVP is, so prepare to be patronized for 3 to 4 minutes while I go through that, because I think it's really important that we sort of break it down as it's sort of the basis for everything we're going to be talking about. So today I'm going to cover what does it really mean, how do you know what to prioritize, and what you can learn from us. So start with simply, let's just fire in MVP. It stands for minimum viable product. Now, minimum being what you're aiming for, the smallest amount of work you can get to bring yourself to market. Now, viable basically means the most usable or the first usable version, something that achieves the goal that you're trying to achieve. The product being obviously self-explanatory, the encompassing idea of your app idea or your vision. Now, there's a few different bits of information out there on MVP. Some people, so I do apologize, just trying to get up my notes. There we go. Some people think of MVP and they think sort of gritty and cheap and ugly or feature lacking, and that's not really how we sort of see MVP. At Bad Dinosaur, we see it as a quick way to get your product to market and validate it, and it can be pretty, but just not everywhere. You want to focus on your key areas, you want to focus on your key flows and core components, and essentially understand the pain points and understand the problems you need to solve initially. Now, the best other part of it is it's cost effective because it's a very quick procedure. Now, this is a famous sort of a diagram that shows basically 2 different development processes. The guy who started this in a blog, Henrik Nieberg, this has been plagiarized 1 million times by a bunch of different people, so I'm not going to change that today. I'm going to plagiarize it as well. But I just wanted to break it down and talk about what each development thread here does. Now, the one at the top here is called the Big Bang development cycle, and it culminates in the built to spec product. At the end here, as you can see, being delivered. Now, what happens throughout the cycle, as you can see, is we've got a very different user sort of, and I know this is simplistic, but it's a very different user experience throughout the development process to, say, an MVP track. So let's just break it down a little bit. I'm going to talk about Big Bang first. So with Big Bang, a first release, we might have something like the wheel created, and it might be a perfect wheel, and it's been perfectly designed, and the code itself works, and the wheel has been stringently designed so that it's going to be its case in its ultimate form. However, we can see that it's not really fit for purpose. It's not viable. It's minimum, but not viable, because the client or the user cannot use this to achieve their goal of getting from A to B. Then on our next release, we're getting closer. We've now got something that resembles a vehicle, but it's nowhere near it. It's ugly, it's uncomfortable, hard to use, and really our user cannot focus on it enough to give accurate feedback. And then finally, we're getting closer to the idea of the spec. We've got something that is technically usable, but it's nowhere near the end route. And finally, we do have the product the customer asked for. However, throughout this entire process, the user or the client has had no opportunity to give any feedback. So they haven't had any hand in shaping the product as it's grown. We've done this massive monolithic development cycle that culminates in a huge monolithic block of release that by the time that's done, there isn't enough time for us to correct things, and there isn't enough time for us to learn. Now, that's really important in MVP development, that we talk about learning, and that's exactly what MVP gives us. Now, the first release for MVP, and this is where you've got to sort of preempt your client or preempt yourselves when you're talking about MVP, is your first release is not going to be what you requested. As you can see here, our client was asking for a car, and they received a skateboard. Now, a skateboard does facilitate this idea of getting from A to B, but it's nowhere near the actual specification that they asked for. However, it does quickly allow us to understand, well, what do they need when they're going from A to B? And the second thing being, they need controls. So we've added some sort of controls here. So immediately, the customer has got the product into their hands. They've given us feedback. They're saying, when I was trying to go to A to B, it would be better if I had controls. So now we design controls. Now, when we've got to that point, they can now start using controls. We're getting feedback on that, and we can start adding features. When we're starting features like a seat or a handlebar here, and again, this is very simplistic, but it helps sort of dictate the idea, that we can start to see what's important. Yes, we can get from A to B, but comfort's important. So we can then start to, and then we've got some pedals there. So obviously, power is important. So then we can start to shape that product around those pieces of feedback that we're getting. And yes, we're not actually a car yet, but we're encapsulating all of the spirit that the client wanted for the product. They're achieving what they want, and it might not be what they think they wanted, but they're achieving what they want. And potentially, you could start stopping development cycles here, because it could be that you've reached this point in development and you decided that's enough for us to go to market and test our theory. That is enough for us to validate our idea. However, should you follow through finally to the end, you can then come and see your final product. And as you can see, it's nothing like another track here, but that's okay, because when you're working with an MVP cycle, this constant feedback loop you're getting between versions means that you can dictate and shape the development process. Now, this works for anything, but it specifically really lends itself well to software, because with hardware, you can see we need to have this sort of componentized, rigid way of building things up. And we build a wheel, we build this axle and frame, and we build the other wheels, and then we've got some sort of body, and then we finally do that. However, with MVP, it allows us to get this sort of idea of what we want at the end out first, to start getting early feedback. And because it's software we're dealing with, and it's in the name, soft, it's moldable. So we can start to build this and change it. And we're not stuck in any sort of pattern. It allows us to pivot, and allows us to shape the idea. So I wanted to talk about one of the pieces of software that we built with one of our clients, and talk about MVP in practice and how it worked. And sort of a bit of background about this client. This is the Lion Cat, and they're a financial advisor to financial advisors based in Edinburgh. And without getting into any of the jargon, because believe me, it melts your brain, they essentially find investment platforms like Aegon or Standard Life, and they find out all this information about them and they put it in one solid place. Now, they used to have a very, very simple WordPress website where they would just update bits of information, and financial advisors could use this as a tool. It was free of charge to use, and it was sort of part of their community thing. What they realized is that this was getting used by lots of financial advisors to do research for their clients, to make sure that the financial advisors were making the right decisions on what investment platforms to go down. So they approached us, and they had this idea of combining their spreadsheet system, which basically showed a pricing output for a financial advisor, so that they could take to their client and say, these are sort of the best plans for your money. Now, as you can see, this is very ugly, and it's very time consuming to make something like this on a case-by-case basis. Now, essentially, we've got ourselves an MVP already. They had their WordPress site, and they had a spreadsheet that did this. However, this is not scalable. So how do we start with it? How do we start with this foundation and start to build an MVP app? And essentially what we did is we took these very two simple concepts, and we started with this. Now, they had a whole host of things they wanted to do after. Now, I'm just going to show you, this is essentially how it works. It's really, really simple. We've got a directory that you can look through and see various bits of information that you would make decisions on the financial investment platforms, and then you can start to then make a pricing comparison. Now, what happened was they managed to release to their clients really, really quickly, and all of the preconceptions that they thought they were going to have, and all the features they thought they were going to build, a lot of them were actually pushed further down the development plan than others. And since their release in January, they actually recouped half of their investment cost in the app already. So this is just since January in sales. So basically, when they released early and quickly, giving something that they knew their clients wanted and needed because they were already doing it, without adding a bunch of extra features to sort of confuse and mask the issue, they didn't draw anything short from themselves. So they were able to then measure through feedback, actual feedback from talking to the clients, which is the most valuable feedback you're going to get, essentially what their next steps are going to be. And now they're working and building on this to shape it around actual clients. So they've not wasted any money building features that they thought were going to get used and aren't. We're not at a stage where they've spent a single penny they didn't need to. And that's a really important thing, that when you're going through a development process, that you absolutely scrutinize these components. And this is why in the previous example, yes, we're going to start with this skateboard idea, and it isn't what we want it to be in the end, but that's okay, because with all of these phases of release and to users, and it doesn't have to be the wider audience, it can be beta test, it can be internal releases, but whatever you do, get an MVP, get a minimum viable product solid first, and get that released somewhere. Now, there's some famous MVPs that you might not know about, or you probably know them, obviously, but you might not know that they brought themselves to market through the MVP methodology. Now, the first one is Twitter. Twitter originally started as an internal group texting tool for the podcast company Audio, and when Apple started to get into the podcast game, they decided, right, we're going to need to diversify. We can't take on Apple. That's ridiculous. So they launched this internal tool they had to the masses. Now, obviously, we know Twitter has become like one of the biggest platforms in the world. So, nothing was stopping them from launching with this ugly interface and this very simple idea. And that's the point we're trying to make, is that when we're talking to our clients, we always say to them, like, please try to focus on now while keeping in mind your vision. But the end result will come, and it will be shaped best by users. Another good example, and this is possibly the absolute sort of epitome of best MVP practice, is the company Zappos. Some of you might remember them. Basically, they started as a very simple website where they would list shoes. And the myth goes that the founders actually lived above a shoe shop, and that they used to just go downstairs and take photographs of the shoes and then come upstairs and upload them to the website. And when they sold, they used to just go downstairs, buy the shoes, and then ship them. Now, they started that way because they had the most minimum viable product out there. Now, behind the scenes, there's this fake automation or mechanical Turk, whatever you want to call it, where that's obfuscated from the user. The user has no idea that there's a human process there. And what they've done is they've stripped all of the pointlessness away and all of the expensive stuff they would have to build, like all the shipping integration, all of the order stuff, just so that they could prove the concept that people were going to buy shoes online. Now, of course, they did, because Zappos sold for close to $1 billion to Amazon in 2009. So from starting in essentially a very manual process and taking the MVP methodology and building their business around that, building it around what their users responded to, help them turn their software company into a billion-dollar company. And then, unfortunately, we have Uber. Uber, believe it or not, did start as an MVP. Originally, it was just supposed to facilitate credit card payments between riders and drivers. And essentially, they have since morphed into a horrible and evil corporation that has its fingers everywhere. But they did start in an MVP methodology because they tested the waters of the market and then quickly realized that they could possibly take world domination on. So there's hope for everyone, I suppose. Now, I spoke a lot of things there about priority. Now, priority is really, really important. Now, obviously, as you saw there, the companies I mentioned, the famous MVPs, prioritized it. Twitter prioritized just showing group messaging. Zappos prioritized selling shoes. And Uber prioritized just facilitating a transaction between a driver and a rider and taking their cut. Now, and with the Landcats case, they just took what they knew best and then transferred it into an app. They took their core idea and their core business and turned it into an app. And we don't have to overcomplicate things, it's more than that. So I wanted to sort of show you an app that I wrote last night after having a beer. And this is Chewy, and it's recyclable dog toys. And this is a stupid hipster app that I just made up, but it's going to show us a ridiculous way of cutting fat away from an idea and drilling down to basically our core concept and why we need to focus on that. So I want to talk a bit about this user flow here. We've got sort of two ways to come in. We've got a login and register. And we've got this, and login and register has email logins, social logins, so login with Facebook, login with Google, two-factor authentication for that security. Register's got email register, and we're going to need to socially register with our Facebook and our Google accounts too. And it's got capture to stop all those bots from getting in. And then we come to a landing page. So we've had to deal with all that development before we even got to the products. So then we're at a landing page, and we finally got a list of the chew toys. And we've got some reviews there and a news feed that people aren't going to read. And then we'll have a look there. We've got order history. We've got order history, tracking, and with tracking, there's a lot of implementation there. And then we've got a buy again button. Now, the buy again button is arguably one of the best ones there because it obviously promotes reselling. However, I'll come back to it. Then we've got this idea of a forum and with threads and direct messages. And I don't know who is still using forums because I haven't used one since 2005, but for some reason this still comes up in requests from some of our clients and their app ideas, because the point I'm trying to make here, and you might see, is that as we start to add all these things on, like a blog with search and archive and shipping domestic, international, we're nowhere near validating our core concept is that we need to get a list of chew toys available for sale, and we need to be able to buy them and them just be sent to our customer. So let's remove some fat. We'll take out login. We don't need it. We don't need register either. We've just got a landing page. And then in the landing page, we've got a list of chew toys there. That's perfect. As soon as the client gets to our app, they can see a list of our products, and they don't need the forum, because what they're going to talk about chew toys for? With each other, there's only so much you can do. You need to think critically about your own idea and be really brutal. Butcher your baby, because it needs to be simple. Take out the blog. No one reads blogs. They're only used for SEO. The only people who read blogs are people who write blogs, in my opinion. So just get rid of it. Then shipping. We can start this. We can validate your idea of selling recyclable dog toys. See if there's an appetite in the market locally. We don't even need international, even domestic shipping. If you can get the manufacturing done and deliver it yourself within your city, say this is launched in Edinburgh, we can start with that. So shipping's out of the equation. With orders, this is arguably one that you might want to keep. However, if you're going pure, minimal, viable product, you would even do away with that and replace it with an email that gets sent to them. Now, quite quickly, we've got just 3 components here we've got to build: a landing page, some sort of payment integration, and an email that sends a receipt to them, and possibly some information about their order. The email could contain all of the information they need, and it could just be left as that, just so that you can prove your concept. Now, with the landing page, we don't need reviews. With a payment, we don't need to save payment method. We don't need anyone paying with Bitcoin, because who cares? Just facilitate card payments. And then with the landing page, take out reviews and take out your news feed. Now, we've started with what we thought was a rounded offering, and something it might look like, a year or 2 down the line. But we can quickly get to market with just these 3 components. We can quickly validate that your product has appetite, and you're much better spending your money. We've eliminated tens, if not 100 screens there. You're much better spending your money on just very simple, get to market quickly, and make sure that your idea works. And that means that when you do come back to start adding these things in, they're added in with feedback from the user. Now, obviously, that's an oversimplification of something. App ideas have nuance, and I'm sure that when you start talking about introducing various tech elements and things like that, seems quite simplistic. That we've just got a list of dog chew toys, but it really is that simple. We just got to strip it down to that to then build it back up. So one of the things we need to research is, and this is super important, because as you saw, all of those elements there were included on a hunch. So we need to question, what do our users want? You want to speak to your potential users. Be transparent about your idea, and ask, do they really need this? And then how do they want to pay for it? Do they want to pay for it at all? Is there anything similar out there, and how is there anything with the same spirit out there, and how are they monetizing it, and how is their offering different? And one thing I would avoid is if you can keep the payment structure, the way that people pay for it, as simple as possible, that is just a barrier that you're just going to bow out of the way. Because as soon as you start getting to subscription services and all sorts of weird things like that, with different tiers, you're going to alienate people very quickly. Their eyes are going to glaze over and they're going to click off. So the next thing you need to do is need to get on board with the idea of continuing to learn after you've even launched your MVP. There is no end to this. This isn't a boxed thing you can do. This isn't a project that you draw a line under, you put it out there, and it just makes money and you don't ever have to touch it again. You need to understand that you need to perhaps pivot from this, and that your idea is going to change with the ebb and flow of the market. So you need to stick to your guns, but listen to the market. Have conviction in your idea, but make sure you compromise yourself and you mold around your users. Your user feedback might not even be just actually like asking them or getting review feedback or anything like that. It might be like you can use Google Analytics, for example, to see which pages are being used. If a page is not being used, don't bother working more on it. Work on something else. Or there's lots of tools out there like Google Analytics is one, Hotjar is another, that allows you to visually see where users are using your app. And you'll quickly understand where your focus point should be. So don't be afraid to deviate away from your plans. Like the best laid plans, are not always the best route. So, one of the things you've got to do is validate every feature idea you have. As we saw earlier, the blog isn't important for you to sell recyclable dog toys, if that isn't even the market. But it's not important for you to prove that. And you need to ask yourself, does this feature vastly improve my offering? Is it critical for me making a change with my offering? And essentially, we have a rule when we are talking to our clients, it's an oversimplification, but sometimes you need a hammer to fix a problem. And it's the 90-10 rule. If we think 90% of the time people are going to use the feature, great, build it. If we think it's only 10%, then why are you wasting your money doing it? Who are these 10% of people that you care so much about? It doesn't matter. Ignore it. And if it starts to arise later, then build it. So that leads us nicely on to sort of what you can learn from us, because obviously we've got this ideology of MVP, and like all ideologies, we try not to push them on people, but it's really worked for us. It's really worked for our clients. It's helped them get to market quickly, and it's helped them validate their ideas quickly, and also really, really cheap compared to building the Big Bang track that I showed you earlier. It's very early on we can decide whether it's going to work, and very early on we can start to mold it so that it does work. And that's one of our processes works like this. I realize this is tiny writing. Don't worry about reading it. I'm going to talk about it. It's just one of our lovely designers made this, and I don't want to start butchering it. So essentially, we start with a workshop where we take your idea, and however bloated, warts and all, we cut it down to that sort of MVP track, or MVP core functionality. And we don't ignore all the things that you wanted. We take that into consideration, but we try to focus the idea and hone it down to this very easy to work with concept. And then from there, what we'll do is we'll draw up the components, and we'll get your proposal together. And the way that we work is we work with time and material, so you can quickly see how long it's going to take, so you can make all of your other arrangements to do with the business, as well as the immediate cost implications of building an MVP. This is what it's going to take to get to market. And then, all's well, you're really impressed with us, and you think our cultish ideas about MVP are perfect for you. So you join up with us and are ready to go. And then we enter a design phase, and this is where our really, really talented designers come in, and they build essentially the whole facade of the app. Every single interface that we're going to do with our components. So that is our MVP to you as a client. And basically, this is how the developers that are listening, this is really, really important, because we find out so much about how someone's going to use an app just from this clickable design prototype that we do first. And I would implore you to do that, because it's often a real risk to jump straight into an IDE and start coding out features. And as a developer myself, that is essentially probably what I would lean towards doing in my private projects. But I shouldn't. I should use the MVP methodology, because if we start with that, we know we can quickly get into the hands of other people, even ourselves, and understand what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like. And then when development kicks off, all of those misconceptions have been addressed, and we can start to then code, the back end into our front end in a way that is validated and supported. And then essentially we come to a pilot phase, and the pilot phase is it's the release of the MVP, if you will, to whatever audience you've chosen. And then from there, you gather feedback, and you just run in a cycle. The whole idea is that the software development is cyclical, and everyone knows about iterative process, but it's really important from a very early stage to understand that that's always going to happen, and it will only make your product better. Every single cycle you do is going to make your product better and more suited for its environment. So some tips and tricks for sort of getting on board with that is don't worry about what you want to build. And I mean specifically when people start to say things like, machine learning, AI, blockchain, that doesn't matter. What you want to build from a sort of geeky perspective, it's amazing that you get to play with new technologies, but focus on why you want to build it, because a project should be based in its goal, not in its components, or not in its technical components. So you've got to trust yourself, trust the idea, but also trust other people when they say to you, oh, that doesn't make sense. And, you know, not just one or two people, ask a few people, you know, start to open it up to, you know, a wider audience and sort of test it. Listen to people, but also have conviction. And as I said earlier, discovery never stops. You're always going to discover new things, and just get used to it. It's really hard when you've had such a long period of time of gestating with an idea and boiling it down and possibly, you know, making it larger and bloated, to step away from that. But you've got to understand that you need to come back to basics to then build it back up. And finally, get a release out as soon as possible. Even if you want to share your clickable prototype before you've even built any features for your MVP with people, that's going to be amazing. Early feedback is the most valuable tool in development for building fit-for-purpose products. And one of the questions is, you need to ask yourself, are you ready to build a tech product? You know, ask your customers, or if they're what they think of the ideas I said. Be transparent, so tell them why you're doing it. You know, people aren't going to steal your idea. I know people tend to be guarded about this, but be transparent. And finally, you need to have a quick look. I mean, a quick Google search usually helps this. Has this been done before? You know, you might be pouring a lot of your savings and all sorts of grant money into something that essentially you're fighting an uphill battle with an already established competitor. And we need to make sure that this isn't already available and sort of what the price point is. However, I would say that if you feel your offering has set itself apart from the competition, and whether that be price point or offering or value, and you feel that you have enough reason to take that on, then absolutely go for it. And internal projects, so that could be if you're a business and you're looking to sort of digitize an existing element of your business, I would start speaking to colleagues about it, to ask them if it's going to actually help the business, ask them if it's going to improve things to the business, and it's not just a you know, it's not just a digitizing for digitizing sake. Often people will throw money at building interfaces and CRMs for things that, you know, necessarily don't need focus at this point in time. So make sure that it's right. And finally, make sure you're not creating barriers to the project's success, and that is overcomplication. If you have trouble explaining this to someone, something's wrong. If you find people sort of staring through you instead of nodding, then something's wrong. You need to strip it down and talk about brass tacks. Talk about the simplest solution. And finally, what's the minimum viable product? Strip it away and find it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ian. A virtual round of applause. That was really good. I learned so much in that. But yeah, if anyone has any questions for Ian, then please feel free to pop it in the Q&A button below. No questions, a stupid question, right, Ian?
That's right. Yeah, you can ask me anything.
But no, that was really interesting. But going back to like the kind of the first few slides that you had there, you know, you had the financial advisors company. You know, how much preparation does a client have to do, you know, before providing that information to you? Because obviously that's a lot of data and a lot of colored spreadsheets and a lot of cells.
Sure.
Like, you know, how do you kind of then work through that information?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question, and it's paramount for any software developer or any agency that's working with a pre-existing business. You know, they know their subject matter better than anyone. So you've got to trust them as well. You've got to trust them that they know what they're doing. You know, they're the experts in this field. So when they've got this spreadsheet that has all these, you know, conditional formatting and things like that, you've really got to ask them. You've got to kind of be brutal and say, well, you know, why do you need this? Why is it important, etc. Because that's X development time. So it's going to cost this. And quickly, that discussion can start to validate things. And when someone really knows their audience, they know what's important. So to answer your question about the time it takes to get materials, with that particular client, we were working with something they had established already over many years. And we were just taking it and digitizing it or creating an app from it. And essentially, it's just the way that we work is that we have a weekly co-design in our MVP cycle, where every week we're releasing to them another version until we're at the final end result. And every week we're having a meeting with the client to actually design this with them. And this is called co-design, and it basically means that they're at the helm and they're driving the project, and they're the product owner. And there's no better person to be the product owner than the people who want the app. So it's essentially, it's not necessarily about how long it takes to get this all together, because the process itself brings this all out. If you have the idea, a co-design process brings the idea to life. Hopefully that wasn't too much waffle.
No, it's really interesting, because I was looking at all those kind of like colored cells, and I'm like, if someone had come up to me and said, can you make a product for me, I'd be like, I have no idea what these numbers mean. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear how you guys kind of take that information and turn it into a brilliant product.
We just break it down to its simplest form. We ask them, we question everything, and therefore you can understand it. And like I said, we could get into all the financial jargon that they use, and it is extensive. We don't necessarily need to, because we're still talking about a software project at the heart of it. The actual subject matter and the components, it doesn't really matter. If we employ the MVP methodology to the process, then we're going to get a good result regardless, as long as our subject matter can be trusted. We put our trust in our clients for that.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So have you got any kind of advice for someone who kind of wants to run before they can walk, in a way, like they just want to skip this whole process, they want a pristine product, like in the first instance? Like, what advice or what would you say to them to do an MVP?
Don't. If you're thinking of yourself at the end goal, then you've not done any of the work to get there. You haven't done any of the work for building it. It's not like you can buy this is a bad example, but a prefab house, it's not going to be exactly how you want it, because it's prefab, it's out the box, it's IKEA. And if you're involved in the design process and you do this in small increments with MVP, then you're going to get exactly what you want, and so your clients, your intended audience, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Cool. You were talking about your kind of idea for your app, and you were removing things like your blogs and your forums and things, because they're not really that useful. So some people might argue that it might be useful, that's they're sticking to their guns, that's exactly what I want. I read blogs all the time, for example, but they're worried that if they don't add those additional things, that they won't get the customers. Like, in this day and age, it's all very much like it has to be a finished product before anyone will take a look at you. So what kind of advice would you say to them?
Essentially, you've got to really scrutinize yourself. You've got to really scrutinize your ideas, and the only way that you can really criticize yourself, in fact, is by asking other people to impartially. It's really, really hard as a single person, if it is a single person that's come up with this app idea, not a group of people, for that dialogue to occur internally. And now, obviously, I created an oversimplification there, where we're talking about a dog chew service, and in that instance, it doesn't need a blog. So the core concept I would say is, what is my core offering, and does this feature make or break it? And if it doesn't make it, if you feel that you cannot facilitate someone doing your core concept without this blog or this feature that you've decided on, then by all means include it. Then you've validated it, and you don't have to be brutal for brutal's sake either. It's fine to include things that aren't going to be used as much, but you feel is on brand, and that's really important as well. Like the idea of brand and things like that. If something is very on brand for your product, and that is fundamental, and you shouldn't sway away from it, because it is part of your offering. It's part of your minimum viable product.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you ever had an instance where you've built an MVP, or someone has built an MVP, and their actual final product ends up being the stripped back version of what they had originally?
So, sorry, do you mean that before they've, well, I mean, most of our clients haven't had an app before. It's their first app.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially what they usually end up with is what they want, because they've been part of the whole process.
Yeah.
There isn't really an instance where someone's expectations aren't met, because the way of building MVP is constantly validating their expectations by giving them what they want. So this is why another reason why MVP process is better than a big bang, because we're not getting into those situations. We're not getting into a situation like we saw in my first diagram, that we get all the way to the end and the clients finally got what they asked for, but it hasn't been touched by them at all. Now, alternatively, we could get all the way to the end on that track, and the client doesn't get what they asked for, but then we're out of development time, we're out of time for the project, we're out of money, because we've spent it all on working down this linear path. Whereas when we're agile with the MVP process, and we're coming back and doing iterations on an MVP, it means that they're shaping it, and there's no way that it can be out with their expectations, because they've been at the helm. They've designed it through feedback.
Yes, we've just had a question come in from an attendee. So the question is, it can be hard to convince your colleagues or managers to release anything less than perfect. Do you have tips on how to get them over the line and on board with the MVP way?
Yeah, it's something that obviously we have to deal with all of our clients. Is the MVP way is a difficult thing to bring people on board with initially, because the hesitation that they're going to go out and release their product to the world, and it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be there, and the people who see it are going to laugh, and they're going to say, "Oh, look at that button shape. That button shape shouldn't be there." You know, and realistically, that's not the case. People don't care about that kind of thing. And also, there's not this big queue of people outside the internet knocking on the door of your website or on the App Store refreshing to look for your app. You know, there isn't going to be this flood unless you shout about it. So if it's fine to release and start with early adopters, start with a small circle, and then start to move out that way. You know, that's the easiest way to describe it to people, is that you know, we all have this idea of perfection, but the work is never finished with software. So you could spend the next decade building an app and then release it. And by the time you've done it, you've missed the boat. So the quickest, most easiest solution is just to say to them, we need user feedback to shape this. And if the best way to get user feedback is to get a version out there in its rawest form, the minimum viable product. And yes, I'm starting to sound like a cult leader now. I'm just saying minimum viable product over and over again. But I just believe in it so much that you know, you've got to have that same passion when trying to convince your colleagues, managers, whatever, that it's the right way to go. And it's, you know, some people want a perfect result at the end of a project, but realistically, a project should have cycles and it should have stages, and that's essentially how you should approach it.
That's really good advice. I hope Ian answered that question okay for you. If not, feel free to ask another one. But no, that's actually really good advice. And you know, like you said, you could spend years and years developing something and you've missed the boat. So when does it stop being a minimum viable product at the end of the day? You know, it
becomes an obsession that you're going to
it just becomes a product you never released into the world. So but yeah, I think a lot of people do tend to just want to like fill about with it, make sure it's perfect.
And that's understandable. Everyone wants to put their baby out into the world and it be perfect. But what we're trying to say is that yeah, we can have it looking good enough and it doing what it needs to. And you know, yes, we still make things look beautiful, but we do it simple things so that when we're making them look beautiful, we're not overcomplicating it. We're not focusing on the wrong things. And yeah, it's just worthwhile keeping that in mind, that this is never going to end, and you've just got to accept it. That you've got to start small and work outwards.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, we've got another question come in from Daniel. Hi, Daniel. He said he's recently finished CodeClan, and he was just wondering if you would need to put in a percentage. How much time do you normally spend on planning versus how much time do you actually spend building the product, and what would that percentage be? And also, is that percentage depending on how much experience you have, or mostly depends on each individual project?
So yeah, there's a few things there. I mean, obviously experience does come into it, because once you've built a certain type of app, there's only a few types of apps out there. And there's only a few sorts of interfaces, and realistically, people aren't going to deviate from what is out there. So you can learn from experience. If you've built apps before, then you can take that into consideration. But I think what he's asking is, how long do I need to start planning before jumping into building? And realistically, the way that we do it is we have like 3 or 4 hours with a client max to start with, getting their idea down. We come up with the components, and then when we have the components, we then start the process not from scratch, but we talk through those components in the concept in the context of them getting an MVP at the end. Now that could be, you know, a couple hours, 2.5 hours. So right there, we've only got 6.5 hours talking about an idea, and then we start design, and we'll do like a week development design in there, and at the end of that, we'll have another 2-hour meeting to talk about that. And it's not about this. It's trying to get away from this idea that you do a chunk of planning and then you do some work. You do your planning first phase to plan out the project, obviously, and then you do a small amount working with those components that you've narrowed down, and then you start building your interface. Now that's safe. We're at that point. You're safe because you actually haven't committed that much time. We're only realistically 1.5 to 2 weeks into our project, and we've already validated all of the components by building the interface. So when we come into the next phase and when we get feedback on that and we have another 2.5-hour meeting, we can then start building these components in with code in the back end. And then guess what? In another week, we're going to do another 2.5-hour meeting or something like that. And it's these short meetings that help shape the project as it goes. It puts it down at these bite-sized elements that essentially take all the scariness of this monolithic project out of the way. Now, having said that, it's worthwhile keeping your eye at the end goal the entire time. We're constantly monitoring where you are in relation to deadlines or whatever. But if you're planning things at that first stage well enough, it's okay to pivot, and it's okay to have the unexpected as you go because you're taking it in small chunks. So yeah, essentially that's how we do it, and it works on every project. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It works on every project.
Cool. I hope Ian's answered your question, Daniel. If not, feel free to ask another one if you want a bit more detail. Yeah, just something that I was just thinking about through the presentation. But do you have an example of a company, whether big or a client that you've worked with, that's done an MVP in a really bad way, and maybe an example of a company that's done it in a really good way and it's really kind of taken that core value of, you know, what the user tells you, you develop that, and then they've created a really great product?
Yeah, so there isn't really a bad way to do an MVP, because the idea is that you're putting as minimal resource into it as possible, and you're validating your idea. A bad way to do an MVP is to get fixed on spec and get your head too focused on spec and be too rigid. Rigidity is always going to stifle creativity. So I would say that, you know, it's not necessarily happened with us, but potential pitfalls of MVP are when you start to forego the core concepts of MVP. When you start to get near the finish line, you start to forget what it is. And I would say that that's always a really hard thing for clients to get their head around. That things can wait for later. Not everything has to be done now. Right? And the cases where you might start to get into problems is where you start to rush features at a late stage because you feel your offering is going to disappoint users. But realistically, the users don't even know what the product is yet, so they've got no expectations to disappoint. So yeah, I would say a good example was Zappos that I mentioned earlier. They had a very clean, lean version that worked, and that's what you need to do. You need to get something out there that just works and that it does what it's supposed to, and then you can start latching on features. But within reason.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, that's what's really great to hear all those things. I think I guess some people can get a bit bogged down, like you said, in specs and it's going to be perfect, when actually what they're doing is they just need to get it out there for the world to see, and then you'll get your feedback and you'll be able to develop it that way. So yeah, I think that's probably a really important key takeaway. from this. But yeah, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to add them in. We have a few minutes left if anyone has anything last minute. But yeah, before we wrap up, I guess say thank you so much to Ian for joining us today. That was really interesting. I definitely learned a lot from someone who's very not techy, and being able to kind of understand, even like knowing where Twitter came from, just having those like really basic icons and things like that, into turning it into what it is today, just from putting out an MVP. So yeah, but yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. There's still time to ask a question if you would like, and we still have a few more minutes, but before we finish up, we do have another CodeBase on the Couch on Tuesday, and that's with Linda Marie Tarasi and Jess Macbeth about presenting your best self online. This is going to be really interesting, so if you want to come along, that's on our website at thisiscodebase.com/events. But yeah, if everyone is all out of questions today, I guess we'll wrap up slightly early. But again, thank you so much, Ian, for joining us today. And yeah, if you want to get in contact with Ian or any of the team at Bad Dinosaur, their contact details are on the screen. We'll send a follow-up email as well with those contact details if you're happy with that, Ian. We can
That's fine, yeah.
release the attendees, and but yeah, I guess we'll finish up. So thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming, guys.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.